Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I am Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is...
Murder Coaster.
Step right up, ladies and gentlemen, and prepare yourselves for one of the most disturbing and horrible stories you have ever heard. The tale of Bishop Gary Heidnik, who'd go on to inspire one of the biggest horror movie villains of all time. Gary Heidnik was many things: a savvy financial investor with a genius-level IQ, a cannibal, rapist, and murderer, as well as a cult leader intent on starting a new perfect race of humans. Get ready for a disturbing ride into the deepest depths of horror. Listener discretion advised.
Let's begin. Prologue. The Bishop and the House of Horror. Police often came to the rundown home of Bishop Gary Heidnik, which also served as his church, the United Church of the Ministers of God on North Marshall Street, an area of North Philadelphia so crime-ridden they called it the OK Corral for gunfights that the drug dealers had in the streets.
Police had been sent there by relatives of missing women to look for their loved ones, and once police were dispatched to the house because the entire neighborhood was complaining of a horrendous smell.
The bishop, who is known for driving a Rolls-Royce around the poverty-stricken slums of Philadelphia, just told the officers that he'd burned a roast, and they'd left.
But if those police officers had looked inside, they'd have seen the cause of the smell was a human head that he was boiling on a pot on his stove, along with a rib cage cooking in the oven.
On March 24th, 1987, when one of the bishop's sex slaves named Josefina Rivera managed to escape, she went to the police and told them she'd been shackled and chained for 4 months in a pit with several other women, where the bishop kept them in an attempt to breed a race of perfect humans.
Josefina told the police that they'd all been starved and forced to eat dog food mixed with human flesh. Beaten, shocked, one woman electrocuted, all in the basement of the same house the bishop held his church services in every Sunday.
The story seemed too wild to be true, and police didn't believe her at first, despite the fact that Gary Heidnik had been arrested 10 years earlier and convicted of kidnapping, rape, unlawful restraint, false imprisonment, and involuntary deviant sexual intercourse.
It wasn't until Josefina showed police the marks on her legs where she'd been manacled and chained that they investigated the claims. What they discovered shocked them to their cores.
Just as Josefina had claimed, in the basement of the bishop's house and church, they found 2 half-naked women, their ankles shackled to heavy chains, shivering on a dirty mattress.
Seeing the police, the women began to weep and kiss the officers' hands, shrieking, "We've been saved! We've been saved!"
When the police asked if there were other women in the house, they pointed to a board in the corner.
When police lifted the board, they saw part of the concrete floor had been broken open and a pit dug out. And in that dark, dank space was another woman, completely naked, ankles shackled, hands cuffed behind her back.
The women were covered in bruises and welts, starved and emaciated, one officer noting they looked like prisoners of war, as they begged to eat some of the ice cream from the freezer. The same freezer the bishop had kept a body in.
An ambulance took the women away, and officers began to search the filthy house where the bishop held his Sunday sermons. There were stacks of pornography. In the oven was a charred roasting pan with human rib bones inside.
And when an officer opened the refrigerator, there was a human arm, causing the officer to run out the door and vomit.
The press ran wild with the story. The New York Post headline reading, "Madman's sex orgy with chained women. Body parts found in Philly's house of horror."
The Daily News ran the headline, "Horror on Marshall Street. Victims tell of beatings, sex, and deaths."
And USA Today proclaimed, "Philadelphia row house site of death and terror."
Meanwhile, novelist Thomas Harris was working away on the sequel to his book, Red Dragon. And when he heard the news that a psychopathic serial killer was keeping women in a pit he dug by hand in his basement, he was inspired to include that in his new novel, The Silence of the Lambs.
And the world would wonder who this Bishop Gary Heidnik, this man who'd be the inspiration for Buffalo Bill, one of the most iconic villains in horror movie history, was.
Chapter 1. Little Gary.
Gary Michael Heidnik was born November 22nd, 1943, in Eastlake, Ohio, a middle-class suburb of Cleveland, to Michael and Ellen Heidnik.
Gary's father, Michael, was a tool and die maker, his mother a beautician of Creole descent. It was a tumultuous relationship, both of them barely functioning alcoholics.
A year and a half after Gary was born, his younger brother Terry was born. The two brothers would have a fraught relationship, constantly fighting, and they both fought incessantly with their father.
It was a very volatile family, and when Gary was just 2 years old, his parents divorced. His father claiming Ellen was a, quote, wild woman and boozer, and Ellen accusing Michael of gross neglect of duty.
Gary was a very, very intelligent child. He'd later be found to have an IQ of 148, putting him at genius or near genius level. He was clever and quick-witted, though he could be cruel and aloof.
Then something happened that would change Gary Heidnik forever. Well, supposedly, that is.
One summer, while Gary and Terry were climbing a tree, Gary tumbled off a branch, falling down directly onto his head, knocking him unconscious, causing him to go into a seizure.
The story goes that instead of taking him to the hospital, his mother simply took him home and put him in bed and prayed over him for days. And when Gary finally came to his senses, he couldn't speak properly and couldn't control his bladder.
And the fall had been so severe it had deformed his skull, making his head look lopsided. And the children began to call him Football Head. And I found some pictures of him as a little kid, and he did, in fact, have a very oddly shaped head as a child.
In some places, this falling from a tree incident is stated as fact, yet in others, like the book Cellar of Horror by Ken Englade, which was one of our main sources for today's episode, it stated that Gary made the whole incident up, that it never happened, and he used it as an excuse for his odd behavior, oddly shaped head, and incontinence.
Regardless, shortly after this incident, Ellen, who'd remarried and decided she didn't want the responsibility of two roughhouse boys who were constantly fighting, sent her sons to live with their father.
Ellen would marry 2 more times after this, both times to black men, and she would tell Gary that his real father was actually black. And though Gary had very pale, milk-white skin, straight light brown hair, and blue eyes, and looked exactly like his father, he would consider himself black and also be attracted to black women.
Gary claims living with his father was hell, that he'd beat him for any infraction and constantly belittle him. And when Gary would wet the bed, which he would do for the rest of his life, blaming it on his head injury that may or may not have happened, his father would hang the urine-stained sheets out his window to humiliate him.
Gary claims that his father would actually dangle him from the window, holding him by the ankles and hanging him 20 feet off the ground.
Gary was odd. He got teased a lot, was called football head, and he just didn't get along with the other children at school. He'd refuse to make eye contact with them and then tell them that they were beneath him, and he was always getting into fights. Once, his father, exasperated by the constant trouble, painted a bullseye on the seat of his jeans and sent him to school as a literal target for the other kids.
In many ways, Gary was a typical baby boomer growing up in 1950s America. He played baseball, and he was in the Boy Scouts.
Gary had 2 obsessions as a kid: the stock market, which he studied compulsively, saying that one day he was going to be a millionaire, and the military.
Such a weird, thing. Those are weird things to me.
Very American.
A kid, though, to be into the stock market, it's very weird. Anyway, he would wear military fatigues and proudly say he wanted to attend West Point.
So, when he was in the 9th grade, his father scraped together enough money to send him to military school, the Staunton Military Academy in Virginia. Probably glad just to get him the hell out of the house.
Gary did exceptionally well at the school, receiving high grades and having no disciplinary issues. But after 2 years, he dropped out. No one knows why, but it's suspected he began having mental issues of some sort.
He returned to Ohio and started at East Lake North High, but after just 6 weeks, switched to East High School, where he remained only a month before dropping out of school and joining the Army at 17. 1961 was just coming to an end, and he'd never talked to his father again.
Chapter 2. You're in the Army now.
Gary Heidnik was a good soldier. After basic training, he requested to be sent to military police school, but he was turned down as the minimum age was 19. Instead, he was made a hospital corpsman and sent to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, for medic training. When he graduated, his ticket was stamped excellent in both conduct and efficiency.
He was then posted to the 46th Army Surgical Hospital in Landstuhl, West Germany, where he took his test for a high school equivalency diploma, scoring a 96%, a nearly perfect score, 28 points above average.
But on August 25th, 1962, he asked to see a doctor, saying he was dizzy, had headaches and blurred vision, making him nauseous and causing him to vomit. And he'd also had a weird tic, his head jerking about uncontrollably. He was beginning to hallucinate and hear voices.
The Army doctor diagnosed him as being in a type of psychosis, prescribing him Stellane, a major tranquilizer for schizophrenics.
And 3 months later, on January 23rd, 1963, Gary was diagnosed as suffering from a schizoid personality disorder and was judged 100% mentally disabled. And to his very strong objections, because he wanted to stay in the Army, he was given an honorable discharge.
He'd served only 14 months of his 36-month enlistment, but received a pension for a service-connected disability of $2,000 a month.
After being discharged from the Army, Gary settled down in Philadelphia, always in communities that were mostly African American. But he did not like the term black, and he always referred to himself as, quote, colored. Though the truth is he was obviously white to everyone who ever saw him.
He went to nursing school and received a state certificate as a licensed practical nurse. He then enrolled at my alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, taking classes in chemistry, anthropology, biology, and commercial law, and started training to be a psychiatric nurse at the Veterans Administration Hospital. But he was kicked out after 4 months because of poor attendance and a bad attitude.
And then, on May 30th, 1973, Gary's mother, Ellen, who was suffering from bone cancer and had long battled depression and other mental disorders, took her own life by drinking a bottle of mercuric acid, a chemical commonly found in beauty shops.
Gary had her cremated, then took her ashes up to Niagara Falls and dumped them into the rushing water.
Gary himself would attempt suicide 13 documented times. He drove his motorcycle head-on into a truck. He ate rat poison. He attempted to hang himself. He ate glass, overdosed on his psych meds, and was constantly in and out of mental hospitals, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily, often put on suicide watch, then taken off, let go, then readmitted. A vicious cycle.
At one point, while being institutionalized at the VA hospital in Coatesville, he went mute. Just quit talking, either communicating in writing or with sign language.
He was asked to undress for a physical, and doctors found a string tied tightly around his toe. When they asked what it was for, he scribbled on a piece of paper that he was trying to induce gangrene, hoping it would spread through his body and kill him. He also refused to bathe and stunk. One of the psychiatrists later noted, quote,
He had delusions, hallucinations, both auditory and visual. He attempted suicide and was suffering from extreme depression. Every sign of extreme psychosis was in operation. Here was a man who had lost touch with reality.
Chapter 3. The Bishop.
In the spring of 1971, Gary climbed into his battered Plymouth, planning on getting a coffee and a donut. Instead, he turned the car west on Interstate 70 and drove until he hit the Pacific Ocean in California and could go no further.
Standing in the surf in Malibu, the voice of God came booming down to him, telling him,
Go back to Philadelphia, Gary, and start a church to care for the mentally and physically handicapped.
So he returned to Philadelphia and incorporated the United Ministers of God on October 12, 1971, designating himself the bishop, the highest position, which would be held for life, typing out a 5-page constitution and declaring himself to have the final word on interpretation of the Bible and the settling of religious disputes.
Some sources say Gary started his church as a means of making money and not paying any taxes, and wasn't, in fact, spiritual or religious at all. while other sources claim he was truly inspired by both the Word of God, which echoed in his head, and the Bible, which he carried around in his breast pocket and constantly read from. The truth is probably some murky place in between, and doused in psychosis.
He began holding Sunday services and drew together a congregation of Black folks, all with intellectual disabilities, hiring a developmentally disabled man named Tony Brown to be his assistant and chauffeur him about.
He lived with a woman named Dorothy, who was 12 years older than him and had lived in mental institutions most of her life. She had no teeth. According to neighbors, he beat her, screamed at her, starved her, refusing to give her any food, and once even shot her in the leg.
Eventually, Dorothy just wandered away and became a street person.
Within a few years, Gary had amassed a few $1,000s from the church. Gary had always been obsessed with money and the stock market, constantly reading the Wall Street Journal since he was a child. And in 1975, he opened an account with Merrill Lynch in the church's name, making it all tax-free, and began investing.
His broker would later say that he was a, quote, astute investor. He was bold, a risk taker, but he knew what he was doing. And that money began to double, triple, and over the years mushroomed into nearly $600,000, an amount equivalent now to over $2 million.
Gary claimed Jesus gave him stock market tips.
That must be nice. And they were right, too. He also invested in real estate, buying a dilapidated 3-story house on Cedar Avenue in West Philadelphia, which he rented rooms out of, eventually getting in an argument with one of his tenants and attempting to shoot him in the face, the bullet just grazing his cheek.
He was arrested for aggravated assault and carrying a pistol without a license, but the charges were eventually dropped, and he sold the house to investors trying to clean up the neighborhood.
And the new owners found the house filthy and squalid, filled with pornography and garbage. And most disturbingly, in the basement, they found Gary had cracked a hole in the concrete and was digging out a pit. Something he'd do again in his next home.
Gary then moved in with his girlfriend, Jeanette Davidson, who had an IQ of 49, a full 100 points lower than Gary's genius-level IQ of 149.
They lived in North 58th Street in a poor neighborhood. Jeanette became pregnant, and Gary, who'd been a medic and was a licensed nurse, insisted he be her sole care provider, forcing her to eat a weird regimen which caused her to drastically lose weight. And he began talking of starting a new race of people, a mixture of black and white.
Eventually, Jeanette's sister came and took her away, and on March 22nd, 1978, she gave birth to a baby girl who was immediately taken away by the state and put in foster care.
Gary then had Jeanette take him to visit her sister Alberta, who was even more severely developmentally challenged than she was, having an IQ of just 30 and the mental capacity of a 5-year-old. She couldn't read or write or even distinguish between coins, and had been living in the Selzen Grove Center, an institution for the severely developmentally challenged, for the past 20 years.
Gary filled out paperwork to have Alberta leave the institution for a short-term visit, and they never returned.
The hospital grew frantic looking for her. Police were called. Gary denied knowing where she was, but eventually a search warrant was served, and police discovered her locked in a storage room in Gary's basement.
A physical examination showed tears in the vestibule of her vagina, traces of sperm in her mouth and throat, and she now had gonorrhea.
Gary was arrested and charged with kidnapping, rape, false imprisonment, unlawful restraint, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, interfering with the custody of a committed person, and reckless endangerment.
The judge found him guilty and sentenced him to the maximum of 3 to 7 years, saying he was evil and dangerous, and if he could have given him a longer sentence, he would have.
Chapter 4. Prisoner number F9748.
Gary was sent to Gratterford Prison, but was soon transferred to the Norristown State Hospital for the criminally insane.
As he'd done earlier in the VA hospital, he went mute, refused to speak.
When a doctor asked why he wouldn't talk, he scribbled on a piece of paper,
"The devil shoved a cookie down my throat."
When the doctor asked him to open his mouth and said he didn't see a cookie in his throat, Gary wrote,
"Pray for eyes."
That's really unsettling.
It's creepy, right?
For 2.5 years, Gary refused to speak a word. Besides this one time when a friend visited him, and the two began yapping away, the guard proclaiming, "Hey, he can talk!" and Gary giving him a wry look and saying,
"Yeah, it must be a miracle."
Gary was denied parole 3 times. But finally, near the end of his sentence on March 24th, 1983, after serving 5 years, he was considered eligible for release, but he was to remain under state supervision for another 3 years. He was now 40 years old.
His investment portfolio had done quite well while he was in prison, and he paid no taxes on these earnings, as it was all in the church's name. So he bought a house on 3520 North Marshall Street, in a neighborhood referred to as the OK Corral, because of the shootouts drug dealers had with each other in the middle of the street.
While the rest of the neighborhood consisted of crumbling row homes, Gary had an actual house with a small yard and a garage. Though it was all ramshackle and trash-strewn, the garage littered with bullet holes.
He also bought a 1971 Rolls-Royce, which was his pride and joy. But he managed to burn out the engine and transmission and replace them both with Chevy parts. Still, he enjoyed rolling around town in his Rolls-Royce, often chauffeured by Tony Brown, a Rolex watch on his wrist. The bishop thinking he looked fine, though he wore dirty clothes, seldom bathed, and everyone says he stunk.
And he started the church right back up, not skipping a beat, many of his congregants returning, as they felt it was a place where they weren't judged for their developmental impairments.
At some point after his release, his former girlfriend, Anjanette, disappeared. To this day, her disappearance is a mystery, many believing Gary killed her and buried her somewhere.
Despite being a man of God, giving Sunday sermons on the nature of sin and calling himself the bishop, Gary was quite active sexually and very promiscuous, as he'd been all his life.
He'd always sought out sex workers and had many lovers. He loved group sex, especially on his waterbed. And he also had a blue Dodge van with imitation fur interior he called Bugs Bunny, that he'd use as a portable bedroom to have sex with prostitutes in.
He'd also still fostered the hope of fathering multiple children with multiple women, then breeding them, thinking he could make a perfect race of beings, a mixture of black and white, which he saw as the future of humanity.
One woman named Jewel he'd been seeing regularly since the 60s, and she'd go to his church services, then have group sex with him in his waterbed. But she wanted no part of having his babies and starting a new race.
His assistant, Tony Brown, had a girlfriend named Gail, and Gary had sex with her as well, even got her pregnant. But like his last child, Protective Services stepped in and took the baby away.
Another woman he saw was Sandra Lindsay, a developmentally disabled woman who he'd met while institutionalized and convinced to join his church. He got her pregnant as well, but she went and had an abortion, causing him to call her a sinner during Sunday services. He'd later offer her $1,000 to have his baby, but she refused. Eventually, she'd end up in the pit of his house of horrors and suffer a horrible fate.
There were other women he tried to impregnate to start his perfect race as well. One woman who was epileptic and suffered seizures constantly, as well as a very skinny woman so mentally challenged she couldn't count or use the telephone, and an obese woman who, quote, looked like a bag lady.
Not having any luck creating his brood of children to form a perfect race of beings, in 1983, Gary looked elsewhere, going to a matrimonial bureau that specialized in finding men wives from other countries, and asked them to find him a, quote, Oriental virgin.
An ad was created and caught the eye of a Filipina girl named Betty Disto in Manila, and the two began writing letters to each other. For nearly 2 years, they wrote back and forth, sending pictures and getting to know each other.
Gary told her he was 5 years younger than he actually was, and that he was a nurse and minister of his own church. He said he was rich, owned his own house, and drove a Rolls Royce.
It sounded good to Betty, whose father had died when she was a child, and on September 29, 1985, Betty flew out from Manila to Philadelphia, where Gary was waiting for her. And on October 3rd, they were married in Maryland.
All was bliss for about a week. Then she came home to find Gary in his waterbed with 3 mentally disabled black women.
She was shocked at the sight, demanded a plane ticket back home. But Gary told her that it was normal in America and everyone did it, and to get used to it, that he was the boss.
Betty would later say that there was never a moment when there weren't multiple women in the house or bed.
Every Sunday, the house would fill up with congregants, all of them developmentally disabled in one way or another, and they'd all pray and sing, Gary having to help them learn the words of hymns, as most of them could not read.
And when church services were over, Gary would force his new wife to watch him have sex with other women, laughing at her when she began to cry. Then he'd force her to cook for him and his lovers, beating her if she refused, telling her he'd kill her if she ever tried to leave him.
But after just 3 months, she reached out to the Filipino community in Philadelphia for help and managed to get a plane ticket. After going to the police and reporting him, Betty hopped on a plane back to the Philippines, and Gary was arrested for spousal rape, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, simple assault, and indecent assault.
But by a stroke of luck for him, it was on the same exact day his parole expired. So he did not break his parole and wasn't sent back to prison. And with Betty in the Philippines and unable to testify at his preliminary hearing, the judge really had no choice but to dismiss the charges.
Perhaps as a way of celebrating, Gary went and bought a brand new Cadillac DeVille, getting all the extras. A custom roof, Continental kit, custom grill, wire wheels, and the best tires in the showroom.
Back in the Philippines, Betty discovered she was pregnant and had a son she named Jesse John, and filed paperwork for her husband Gary to begin sending her child support, something he'd refused to do, and eventually be brought to court over because, yeah, he was a complete scumbag piece of shit.
Chapter 5. Josefina Rivera.
I said classified. Nah, this shit right here be classified. Exclusive. We can do this how we do it. This shit classified. Exclusive. You ain't part of this movement. Shit be classified. Exclusive. Got him drooling. Shit be classified. Exclusive. I said classified. Shit be classified. Exclusive. Classified. Exclusive. Classified. Exclusive.
It was the night before Thanksgiving, 1986, and Josefina Rivera, a pretty, street-smart young woman who sometimes resorted to prostitution, was having a hard time. She'd been fighting with her boyfriend, leaving their apartment in a huff, and was now trying to turn a trick on the cold, hard streets as a chilly rain began to fall.
Then her luck changed, or so she thought, when a brand new, pewter-over-white Cadillac Coupe de Ville pulled up. A smiling white guy with a Rolex watch behind the wheel.
The man asked her if she was hustling, and she said yes, she was. They set a price, and she jumped into the luxury car, telling him her name was Nicole.
He told her his name was Gary Heidnik.
After taking her to McDonald's, Gary brought her on home.
The house was weird, dilapidated, and crumbling, in a dangerous neighborhood. And he'd begun gluing money to the walls, pennies in the kitchen, and $1 and $5 bills throughout the hallway.
I can see the pennies maybe, but gluing $5 bills all over your hallway? That's fucking crazy, isn't it?
Weird.
It was dirty, it smelled. There was 2 mangy dogs running about.
He asked her if she wanted to watch a horror movie. And
Watch out!
She declined, telling him she had to get back soon, feeling trepidation sink into her bones, thinking maybe coming here wasn't a good idea.
After having sex on Gary's waterbed, as Josefina went to put her clothes on, he grabbed her by the neck and choked her unconscious, slipping a pair of handcuffs on her. Then he jerked her to her feet, let her down into the cold, damp basement, where a dirty mattress sat in a corner, chains dangling from the ceiling.
He used muffler clamps to manacle her ankles to the thick chain, screwing them in place and using superglue and a hairdryer to seal the bolt and nuts together.
When her legs were chained tightly together, he left.
Josefina was cold. She was only wearing a shirt and was naked from the waist down. She looked around. There was a boarded-up window across the room, and in one corner the concrete had been smashed apart and a shallow pit dug in the ground. She hoped it wasn't a grave.
Then Gary appeared, coming down the steps with a glass of orange juice and an egg sandwich. And although she was hungry, she refused the meal, thinking it might be poisoned or drugged.
Suit yourself, Gary told her, taking a shovel and going to the pit and beginning to dig, filling bags with the dirt as he worked and setting them aside.
As he dug, he talked, telling her how he'd always wanted a family, lots and lots of kids, and he'd fathered several children, but they'd all been taken away from him. He told her, quote, "Society owes me a wife and family. I want to get 10 women pregnant and keep them here and get them all pregnant. Then, when they have babies, I want to raise those babies here too. We'll be one big, happy family."
He put the shovel down, raped her, and left.
Alone, Josefina immediately began working at the bolts on her shackles, managing to free her left foot, which gave her enough room to reach the window, prying the covering up with an old pool stick.
She got herself up and out the window, going as far as the chain on her right foot would allow her, and then began screaming, "Help, help, help me, please, somebody help me."
But there was always someone screaming in this neighborhood they called the OK Corral, and Josefina screamed herself hoarse to no avail, the neighbors all ignoring her frantic screams.
Ugh. Gary, hearing the screams and realizing what was happening, first ran out into the yard and tried to shove her back into the window, but she went limp, so he sprinted down the stairs and into the basement, then began to reel her in like a fish by pulling the chain, dragging her back through the window and into the basement.
Once he had her back in the basement, he threw her into the shallow pit, which she barely fit into, beating her down into it with a board, then covered the hole up with a piece of plywood and set the bags of dirt atop it. She screamed, but she couldn't breathe and needed air.
To cover the sound of her screams, he brought a radio down and cranked up the volume.
He left her there, cramped into the tiny hole, curled up, chin on her knees, unable to move, for over 24 hours. When he came back, he had another woman with him.
Chapter 6. Sandra Lindsay.
Sandra Lindsay, who'd once been the bishop's lover and endured his wrath after having an abortion, had a headache.
She lived with her mother and sisters in a little apartment and left to go to the corner store and get some Tylenol. When who should she run into driving a brand new Cadillac but the bishop, who invited her back to his house, telling her there was something exciting he wanted to show her.
Gary brought Sandra down to the basement and cordially introduced her to Josephina, as if they were at some kind of party or a cocktail lounge.
With her developmental disability, Sandra didn't seem to realize what was happening, didn't find it odd that Gary had a half-naked woman chained up in his basement.
After introducing them, Gary calmly explained to Josephina that Sandra was an old friend who had often promised to have his babies, but had always backed out, once even having an abortion. But now she was gonna have his babies, whether she liked it or not.
He then raped both of them, one after the other, and chained them together.
When Sandra didn't return home, her mother and sisters began to worry, calling around, eventually contacting Tony Brown, who said she was probably over at that white preacher's house.
So her sister Teresa and two cousins came to the house looking for her.
Gary, watching them from the basement window, refused to answer, and eventually they left.
Sandra's family then went to the police and reported her missing, telling them a white man named Gary was holding her prisoner, even giving them his address.
So police went to his house, but again, he just hid out and didn't answer the door. The police then went and tracked down Tony Brown, asking about this weird white preacher.
Tony told them Gary's last name was Heidnik, but he spelled it completely wrong. So when police entered the name into their computer system, they got nothing back.
Of course, if they'd spelled his name correctly, an insane rap sheet full of kidnapping and rape charges would have come up, showing he'd already served 5 years in prison.
Gary then forced Sandra to write a letter to her family, saying simply, "Dear Mom, I will call. Do not worry."
Gary mailed the letter from New York to throw off any investigation, and it worked perfectly. Although her family knew something was horribly wrong, as she never wrote letters, always called on the phone, often called on the phone because she liked using the phone. But the police bought this story.
To the cops, although she was developmentally challenged, she was still 25 years old, a grown woman. If she'd run off to New York, that was her right, and the investigation into her disappearance ceased. Meanwhile, life in the basement was a living hell. He'd beat them with his shovel if they made any noise. To punish them, he'd either put them in the pit for a day or two with no food, or handcuff one of their hands to a bolt in the ceiling, forcing them to stand for hours on end with an arm up in the air.
Gary fed them a diet of crackers and water, occasionally giving them oatmeal for breakfast or a Pop-Tart, and on special days, some shriveled hot dogs or takeout fried chicken. They relieved themselves into a stinking bucket and cleaned themselves with baby wipes that he brought them.
Chapter 7. Lisa Thomas.
Lisa Thomas was a teenage mother and high school dropout, but with a lot of spunk and personality, living with her mother, the family surviving on welfare.
On December 22nd, 1986, Lisa was strolling down the street when Gary pulled up in his Cadillac, offering her a ride.
At first, she refused to get in the car, telling him she was no prostitute and to keep moving.
But he told her he was a nurse and a man of God and was just offering her a ride. It was a cold and rainy night, and he said he'd be happy to take her wherever she wanted to go.
In the end, the young girl was impressed with the weird white man in his fancy car, so she accepted the ride. Then, as he wined her and dined her, buying her clothes and taking her to TGI Fridays, saying he was going to bring her on a trip to Atlantic City.
He brought her back to his house, drugged her, had sex with her, then handcuffed her and let her down into the basement and introduced her to Josefina and Sandra, who were cowering naked in the pit, which had been dug out enough to hold them both now.
He brought out peanut butter and jelly and a loaf of bread. But before he'd let anyone eat, he performed a weird ritual, making Lisa kiss his buttocks and say he was the boss before raping her.
Chapter 8. Deborah Dudley.
On New Year's Day, 1987, Gary abducted 23-year-old Deborah Dudley and added her to the women in his basement. There were now 4 women chained up in Gary Heidnik's basement.
How or where Gary picked up Deborah is unknown to this day, as sadly she is not with us to tell her story. But we do know that she was a strong and defiant woman who constantly provoked him from the moment she was added to his disturbing harem.
Deborah's stubborn insolence was a bother, a thorn in his side, as she fostered defiance in the other girls as well.
In order to maintain dominance, Gary would play with them psychologically, force them at the threat of death and violence to have sex with each other, and then make them beat each other with a shovel.
Whenever he left the house, he would put one in charge, who would be rewarded with food, and nearly always it was Josefina, who was learning to manipulate him. When he returned, he'd ask her who had been bad while he was gone, who'd screamed for help or tried to escape, and have Josefina beat the offender with a shovel.
Out of all the women, Josephina was the smartest and most cunning. She'd learned to manipulate Gary and establish herself as the alpha, while Sandra Lindsay was at the bottom, lost in confusion and horror.
Their hygiene eventually became so bad that he finally relented and let them bathe, bringing them up one at a time and allowing them to soak in the bathtub, still chained and manacled. Then he'd rape them on his waterbed before forcing them back downstairs.
But with Josephina, he began letting her hang out upstairs for longer and longer periods of time. He had her cook for him and clean, began trusting her not to run away, rewarding her with food and other small comforts. They'd lay on the couch together and watch romantic movies.
While he began letting Josephina eat with him, real food, the others he began feeding dog food, often making sandwiches with it.
Chapter 9. Jacqueline Askins.
First cut is the deepest. Shallow text on the deepest. Expensive taste on the cheapest. Never mind.
On January 18th, Gary picked up an 18-year-old sex worker named Jacqueline Askins, who was so small and petite that when he bolted the muffler clamps to her ankles, she slid right out of them.
The girls had established a pecking order and distinct personalities now. Sandra was at the bottom, becoming lethargic and confused, unable to follow Gary's orders, so he'd command the other girls to beat her with a shovel.
Jacqueline was the baby of the group.
Deborah was the bad girl and rebel, always giving a snide remark, challenging him.
And Josephina was the queen.
Gary was being harder and harder on Sandra, who was slipping deeper and deeper into an almost catatonic state, refusing to eat, which drove Gary mad as he thought she was pregnant.
At one point, Gary had her in the pit as a punishment for not listening and not eating. But desperate for air in the confined space, she'd managed to get her fingers through the planks covering it and move them aside. And for that infraction, he handcuffed her wrists to a beam in the ceiling.
As she hung there from the ceiling, Gary would force pieces of bread into her mouth, jamming them down her throat.
Eventually, she grew feverish, began to vomit, then just dropped, swaying slowly there from the ceiling by one arm.
When Gary came down to the basement and found Sandra dangling from the ceiling by her arm, he uncuffed her body dropping to the ground with a thud, seemingly lifeless, and kicked her into the hole, saying she was faking it.
But she was not faking it. She was dead.
So he hauled her upstairs into the kitchen, and not knowing what to do with her body, knowing that her family was looking for her and that he couldn't just dump her somewhere, as suspicion was already on him, he began dissecting her, sawing off her head, arms, and legs, filling his freezer with body parts, then buying a food processor and grinding up the meat, mixing it with dog food and feeding it to his dogs as well as to his captives in the basement.
He boiled her head in a large pot on the stove and sought to destroy her hands, feet, and rib cage by cooking them in the oven, which caused a horrendous stench so awful it permeated the entire neighborhood, and the police were called.
But Gary just told the cops that he'd fallen asleep cooking a roast and they left. And that was that.
And when Deborah started talking back, being snide and causing trouble, as she always did, He dragged her upstairs and showed her Sandra's head boiling away in a pot and said she'd be next if she didn't start cooperating.
Captives were so starved that they knew they were eating parts of Sandra, yet did it anyway.
At one point, Gary's dogs came down with Sandra's femur bone, meat still glistening on the end, and all the girls salivated at seeing the bone, wishing they could get the raw meat.
He turned them into cannibals.
And through it all, Gary had his weekly Sunday sermons. The bishop preaching the gospel of Gary and the glory of God, while his sex slaves sat huddling in a dark pit below.
The girls in the basement worked out a plan. They'd managed to dig up a piece of lead pipe, and Deborah was going to strike Gary over the head with it, the others pummeling him and stabbing him with whatever they could get their hands on.
But sly Josephina, always looking for ways of aligning herself with Gary and gain his trust, alerted him to the plan.
The drama was making Gary grow incredibly paranoid about leaving the house. He knew they could hear him leave, and that they knew he was gone when there were no footsteps. So he decided to take away their hearing.
Oh man, this one's really, really fucked up, man. So, cuffing the girls to the ceiling, using a plastic bag as a gag and wrapping duct tape around their mouths, he inserted a screwdriver into their ears, attempting to gouge out their eardrums. He did this to each of the women, besides, of course, Josephina. Fuck.
He also began to shock them with the bare wires of an extension cord, placing the ends to their chains, laughing as they jerked about, electricity coursing through their bodies.
On March 18th, he decided they all, besides Josephina, needed to be severely punished and put them in the hole. He then had Josephina fill the hole with water from a hose, then gave her the electrical cord and ordered her to shock them. Josephina snaked the cord down into the darkness of the pit, where the three women shivered in the water. The wires hit little Deborah's chain, and she cried out,
"He's killing me!"
before falling limp to the murky water.
Lisa Thomas called out, "You killed her! You killed her!"
Gary simply stated, "Nothing's wrong with her. I don't want to hear your bullshit."
But she was very much dead.
Gary then pulled the others out of the pit and fed them dog food and human flesh sandwiches, saying, "Aren't you glad it wasn't one of you?"
He then made Josephina write out a confession saying it was her that killed Deborah, making the others sign it as a witness.
Since Deborah had no connections to him, Gary felt he could just toss her body somewhere. And in no hurry, he kept the body in his storage freezer with his ice cream while he decided on a place to dump her.
Chapter 10. Agnes Adams.
Gary and Josephina's relationship grew and grew. He now not only let her hang out upstairs to cook, eat, and watch movies with him, he began taking her out on the town.
They went shopping together, then to restaurants, and would even hold hands. He even introduced her to Tony Brown.
Gary took her into his confidence, telling her how if he was caught, he knew how to beat the rap by acting crazy.
He then had Josephina help him dispose of Deborah's body.
He had Josephina spread a blanket on the floor then took Deborah from the freezer and laid her out upon it, forcing Josephina to look at her face, saying it would make her stronger.
They loaded the body into one of Gary's many cars, an old Dodge Dart he thought looked inconspicuous, then drove out into the Pennsylvania countryside to a lonely rural stretch known as the Pine Barrens, down a dirt road, and tossed her into the weeds like so much trash.
Thinking he'd made a fool accomplice out of Josephina, he took her out in his Cadillac to find another sex slave, coming across 24-year-old sex worker Agnes Adams, who'd worked with Josephina at the Hearts and Flowers strip club.
They took her back to the House of Horror, where Gary had sex with her, choked her out, cuffed her, took her to the basement and threw her into the pit, telling Josephina,
"Well, that was easy. Let's do it again tomorrow night."
Josephina agreed, but the next day said she wouldn't help him unless he let her see her family, telling him they hadn't seen her for 4 months.
After much cajoling, Gary finally agreed, thinking that she would never go to authorities since he'd made her sign a confession, saying it was her who'd electrocuted Deborah.
He also warned her that if she ran off, he'd just immediately kill the others, dispose of their bodies, and deny everything.
So they devised a plan. Josephina would go and visit her family, then pick up a woman she knew, and then meet with Gary at a gas station at midnight.
But as soon as Gary dropped her off, she beelined it for her boyfriend's apartment, frantic and desperate.
Her boyfriend was surprised to see her, as he thought she'd left him. It had been 4 months since she stormed off after they had an argument, and he didn't believe her crazy story about some white preacher feeding prostitutes to his dogs and trying to start the perfect race. But after a while, she convinced him, and he took a hammer and said, "Take me to the guy. He'd take care of him."
But on the way to the gas station where Gary was waiting, Josephina decided to call the police instead.
And just like her boyfriend, the police didn't believe her at first either. But after she showed them the bruises and scars on her ankles where she'd been shackled, they went to the gas station and detained Gary Heidnik while they investigated the matter.
When the police approached Gary, he asked them if it was about the child support he'd failed to send to the Philippines. They told him no. It's about kidnapping, rape, and homicide.
Chapter 11. The Trial.
After his House of Horrors was discovered and his captives freed, Gary Heidnik was charged with murder, kidnapping, rape, aggravated assault, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, indecent exposure, false imprisonment, unlawful restraint, simple assault, and indecent assault.
Gary claimed the women had just all been there in the basement when he moved into the house. He just found them there and decided to keep them.
On April 23rd, 1987, Gary Heidnik appeared in court for the first time since his arrest.
While he appeared dull-eyed and unaware of what was happening, he'd been intelligent enough to hire a slick lawyer with a reputation for defending sensational cases, one Charles Peruto.
Gary was dressed casually. He wore a blue Hawaiian shirt with flowers on it, and stunk so badly his lawyer had trouble sitting beside him.
The proceedings ended with Dr. Paul Hoyer of the County Medical Examiner's Office giving evidence regarding the body parts and other human remains found in Gary's kitchen, listing them off like a horrible shopping list from hell. 2 forearms, 1 upper arm, 2 knees, and 2 segments of thigh, all cut with a saw, the tissue, muscle, and skin still attached. In all, 24 pounds of human remains carefully wrapped and stored in the refrigerator.
Gary Heidnik was then indicted and held for trial.
The trial began on June 20th, 1988, Gary pleading innocent by reason of insanity.
His lawyer put Josephina on the stand and accused her of instigating many of the beatings and of electrocuting Deborah Dudley, which she admitted to, saying she was ordered to do it under punishment of death.
When Lisa was cross-examined, she too accused Josephina of being Gary's willing partner in his acts of death and depravity. However, her testimony was refuted when Jacqueline took the stand and told the court that Josephina only did Heidnik's bidding when she was under threat of death or punishment, and that it was Josephina's bravery and intelligence that had saved them all.
Gary's lawyer then asked the judge to instruct the jury to consider the possibility that Josephina was actually an accomplice.
Judge Abram answered that she would be prepared to do so, as long as he understood that it would indicate to the jury that if Gary was capable of enlisting the aid of an accomplice, then he was clearly not insane.
Ooh, mic drop. Wisely, Gary's lawyer decided not to pursue the point.
On June 30th, 1988, after 16 hours of deliberation, the jury found Gary Heidnik guilty on 18 charges. 2 counts of first-degree murder, 5 counts of rape, 6 counts of kidnapping, 4 counts of aggravated assault, and 1 count of involuntary deviant sexual intercourse.
The very next day, the jury unanimously sentenced Gary to death by lethal injection for the murders of Deborah Dudley and Sandra Lindsay.
Just as he had throughout the trial, Gary just sat there, showing no signs of emotion when the sentence of death was read.
For 11 long years, Gary Heidnik sat on death row as his appeals process played out, attempting suicide several times. Finally, on July 6, 1999, at 10:29 p.m., Gary Michael Heidnik was executed by lethal injection at the Rockview State Correctional Institution in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania.
His last meal was 2 slices of cheese pizza and black coffee. He was then cremated, and after his death, no member of his family would come to claim his remains.
To this day, Jacqueline, Agnes, and Lisa have various levels of hearing impairment because of the damage Heidnik did with his screwdrivers.
Together with Josephina, they instituted several proceedings to gain access to the funds in Gary's Merrill Lynch account and divide them equally between them as criminal compensation.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Gary Heidnik. Thank you so much for listening.
And you have a story you'd like us to cover, let us know at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Farewell.